And now let's talk about the reality of the fall. Fairy tales don't just present readers with the truth about creation. They also illustrate the results of the human failure to obey God's one condition. A failure that invited evil into the good creation. Fairy tales present us with this reality when we encounter both nobility and brutality, beauty and ugliness, harmony and conflict, real good and real evil. Unless you live in the suburbs, this is reality. Maybe even if you live in the suburbs. A reader of fairy tales learns all kinds of moral teachings, what Chesterton calls noble and healthy principles. Jack the Giant Killer teaches us to kill our giants, especially if these giants are our pride. Cinderella is the lesson that the humble will, in the end, be exalted. Beauty and the Beast shows that one must be loved before one is lovable. The allegory of Sleeping Beauty tells how the human creature was blessed with all birthday gifts, yet cursed with death, and how death may also perhaps be softened to a sleep. That's Chesterton again. Besides moral lessons, fairy tales bring up questions, moral quandaries. Is it okay for Jack to steal the talking harp and the golden goose from the giant at the top of the beanstalk? Puss in Boots prompts us to ask, when is trickery justified? Morality isn't always a simple affair, and in fairy tales it invites us into the complexities of being created a moral creature with real choices. This fairy tale staple is fundamental to the biblical worldview. The power and scope of evil is a truth that fairy tales offer. In them we encounter evils like ogres and wolves and other villains whose very presence is a sign of the evil that threatens and often seems as if it would overwhelm us. We encounter them, but we also learn through fairy tales that they can be overcome, sometimes with a little bit of help, sometimes with help from a supernatural source. Important lesson indeed. Neil Gaiman wisely said that fairy tales are more than true, not because they tell us that dragons exist, but because they tell us that dragons can be beaten. Of all the evil characters in fairy tales, I found Red Riding Hood's wolf the scariest. He's been called the Big Bad Wolf, but that name presents a canine domesticated by the poet's pen. The wolf I encountered, alone in the dark woods of my imagination, was a horror that can't be tamed with alliteration. One of the greatest lessons that permeate fairy tales is that one cannot take the world for granted, especially not its people. Evil does not just come to us as beasts and villains. Evil is also found in the intimacy of our closest relational circles. A lot of this kind of evil is signaled in the form of stepmothers. Hansel and Gretel's, Snow White's. In Harry Potter, it's his uncle and his aunt, and his cousin. Again in Cinderella, we find evil within the family unit. Cinderella's mother, who had been the nicest person in the world, was replaced by a stepmother who was the haughtiest, proudest woman that the world had ever seen. The hyperbole emphasizes the idea that the effects of sin are not experienced only by the wicked, but also by the innocent. For Cinderella was of an exceptionally sweet and gentle nature. Both the Bible and fairy tales remind us that evil is not just out there. It is something with which we struggle within ourselves and within those who are closest to us. When I look at the us versus them conflict within our culture and the church, I'm thinking that a lot more people need to be reading fairy tales. Fairy tales present reality. They tell us that there is evil in the world. They tell us that we have moral choices between good and evil. It tells us that evil is complicated. It tells us that even if we are innocent, we are not immune from evil. And it tells us that we have to deal with evil both within ourselves and within our closest intimate family units. So about exposing children to evil. In our modern culture, we have an inclination to protect children from the world as it is. So we sanitize the stories that we tell our children. Even the stories we find in the Bible. Disney's version of Cinderella comes to mind. The version of Cinderella given to us by the Brothers Grimm show the evil stepsisters chopping off a toe and carving down a heel in order to make the glass slipper fit. Later, after Cinderella and her prince are married, the stepsisters' eyes are pecked out by birds for their bad behavior. I'm not saying that you need to read these Grimm originals to your 4-year-old. But sanitizing the fairy tales might not be the best for our children either, because it can give them an unrealistic understanding of reality. The real world isn't just sunshine and lollipops, and it does our children no good for us to hide these facts from them. Rather than taking the child out of reality, fairy tales present her with the reality of the fall and the truth about the life before her, one in which she will struggle against, sometimes, severe difficulties. Through the symbols of evil in fairy tales, the child experiences the presence of evil and the moral dilemmas that sin presents us in real life. And it presents it in a symbolic space. As children grapple with the complexities and contradictions and evil as presented in these stories, they will develop the resources to live in a fallen world. Encounters with injustice and occasionally brutality bring the reader into another important biblical reality. Because fairy tales expose the tension that exists between the good creation and the sin that has entered it through the fall, they carry in them a sense that things are not as they should be. They create in us also a longing for things to be what they ought to be. C.S. Lewis used the term Sehnsucht to describe this feeling, which people often translate as nostalgia. But it has a little more longing or yearning to it. Everybody has a sense that there is something wrong with the world. It's sin and its effects. The longing comes from a desire for the fairy tale's happy ending. All this is consistent with what we find in the Bible. First, we were created in the image of God. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." He placed us over all that he had made. Male and female were placed upon the throne of creation. In the fall, it all went wrong. In many ways, we fell from our thrones, or dragged each other off of them, and we abandoned our kingly responsibility to see the world flourish. We used our authority to exploit each other and the world. Nothing is how it's supposed to be, but we long to see it restored or redeemed. That's Sehnsucht. Cinderella was an exceptional young woman, but the stepmother could not endure her. And so she mistreated her. She thrust upon her all the meanest tasks of the house. The combination of the goodness of Cinderella and the injustice of her treatment at the hand of her step-relatives creates a sense of longing for the past, for the life as it was when the real mother lived. This is Sehnsucht. But fairy tales don't just leave us in the longing. They end with, "and they lived happily ever after." In fairy tales, the good are elevated to their rightful position, and the universal longing is satisfied. Importantly and beautifully, the happy ending isn't the result of the individual overcoming evil with their own cleverness or strength. They get help, sometimes from a simple woodsman or even a bird. But often they get some kind of supernatural assistance to achieving their happy ever after ending. For the miller's third son, it was a talking cat with a bunch of tricks up his boots. Cinderella gets help from her fairy godmother to achieve her happy ending. So gratifying is the happily ever after ending that not only does nearly every fairy tale end with it, but almost every story we tell. In Notting Hill, Hugh Grant rushes across town with his quirky friends to tell the gorgeous superstar Julia Roberts that he'd like to date her again. And they get married on top of it all. In Zombieland, after they escape from thousands of undead at the amusement park, Jesse Eisenberg finally gets the family he always wanted, and I doubt if Emma Stone will fill the role of sister. And in all the Die Hard films, Bruce Willis ends up living happily ever after, until the next Die Hard film. In the last one, he shoots Timothy Oliphant through a pre-existing bullet hole in his shoulder, and he wins the day and saves his estranged daughter, who isn't going to be estranged anymore. We know it's going to happen, and we love it every time it does. Why does this happy ending resonate so profoundly in our souls? Maybe because it's reality, or a glimpse of a reality that our souls know is on the way. Tolkien says that the happy endings give us a glimpse of the reality of the ultimate fairy story that culminates in the final return of Jesus. In other words, the fulfillment of all God's promises. We know that the full happily ever after is not yet our experience. In the story of the Bible, redemption has been achieved through Christ's death and resurrection, but it is not yet ultimately fulfilled. Humanity and the rest of creation are still waiting for this. Fairy tales have been reminding us about reality for a long time now, and as we've seen, they've given us a pretty accurate picture of it so far. Maybe they're right about the happy ever after ending too. And what does a happily ever after ending look like in a fairy tale? Well, it's a wedding and a coronation. We find the coronation and the wedding in Revelation 21. I saw a holy city, a new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a beautiful bride dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away." He who was seated on the throne said, "I am making everything new." In fairy tales, we find the fundamental biblical truths regarding creation, the fall, redemption, and fulfillment, the essence of the story of the Bible. This is not to say that reading fairy tales is the same as reading the Bible, or that we can just leave our children alone to consume them. Who but parents can better make the connections for children that we have made here? But fairy tales are good. They present a world that inspires awe and wonder, but also a world with limits. Fairy tales remind us that we can expect to face evil in the world and in ourselves. They show that evil can be overcome, but not only by efforts of our own, but also by divine intervention. Fairy tales encourage our hope that although things are not as they should be, they will one day be. Some people say that the Bible is just a bunch of fairy tales. I hope you can now see that this is not really the insult that they think it is. Thank you very much, and God bless.